The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like a shroud, but it could not mask the acrid smell of gunpowder and death that had settled over Cold Harbor. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery pressed his pocket watch closed with trembling fingers for 30 in the morning, June 3, 1864. In less than 30 minutes, he would lead his men into what would become known as one of the most catastrophic frontal assaults in American military history. The previous weeks had been a relentless dance of death between Ulysses Grant's Army of the Potomac and Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Since crossing the Rapidan River in early May, Grant had pushed his forces through the wilderness, past Spotsylvania Courthouse, and now to this crossroads settlement called Cold Harbor. Each battle had cost thousands of lives, yet Grant pressed on with grim determination, earning him the nickname the Butcher among his own troops. Morrison could hear the low murmur of prayers from the trenches behind him. Many soldiers had taken the unprecedented step of pinning paper slips with their names and addresses to their uniforms, knowing they might not survive to be identified otherwise. The sight of these makeshift dog tags sent a chill through even the most hardened veterans, according to contemporary accounts from the Richmond Dispatch, published just days after the battle. This grim preparation had become commonplace among Union forces, who had witnessed Grant's costly tactics throughout the Overland Campaign. Confederate General Robert Edward Lee had chosen his ground well. His forces occupied a series of low ridges and rolling hills that provided excellent defensive positions. The earthworks his men had constructed were formidable, zigzagging lines of trenches protected by sharpened stakes with carefully positioned artillery that could sweep the open ground before them. Lee's veterans, though outnumbered and increasingly worn down by the campaign, remained confident in their ability to repel another Union assault. The plan, as Morrison understood it, was deceptively simple and terrifyingly flawed. At dawn, 3 corps of the Army of the Potomac would launch simultaneous attacks against the Confederate lines. The 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock would strike on the left. The 6th Corps under Horatio Wright would attack in the center, and the 18th Corps under William Smith would assault on the right. The theory was that such a massive, coordinated attack would overwhelm the Confederate defenses and break Lee's army once and for all. But as Morrison studied the terrain through his field glasses, he could see the fatal flaw in Grant's strategy. The ground between the Union and Confederate lines was largely open, offering little cover for advancing infantry. The Confederates had positioned their artillery to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn the advance into a deadly gauntlet. Worse still, the various Union corps would be attacking at different times and in different directions, negating the supposed advantage of a coordinated assault. The eastern sky began to lighten, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Morrison could see his men checking their weapons one final time, their faces grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Many were recent recruits, heavy artillery soldiers who had been pressed into service as infantry due to the Army's desperate need for manpower. They had trained for weeks to handle the massive siege guns, not to charge across open ground into the teeth of Confederate defenses. As the minutes ticked by, Morrison reflected on the campaign that had brought them to this moment. Grant's strategy of continuous engagement had indeed prevented Lee from maneuvering freely, but it had come at an enormous cost in human lives. The Union Army had suffered over 50,000 casualties since crossing the Rapidan, losses that would have broken lesser commanders, but only seemed to strengthen Grant's resolve. The signal would come soon, and with it, one of the most tragic hours in American military history would begin. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, the Union artillery opened fire, sending shells screaming across the Virginia countryside toward the Confederate positions. The bombardment was meant to soften the enemy defenses, but the Confederate earthworks had been constructed with such skill that the shells did little more than churn up dirt and announce the coming assault to Lee's waiting forces. Captain Thomas Aldrich of the 8th New York Heavy Artillery crouched in the forward trench, watching the artillery barrage with growing unease. His regiment, like Morrison's 1st Maine, had been converted from artillery to infantry out of desperate necessity. The men around him clutched their rifles with white knuckles, many having never participated in an infantry assault of this magnitude. The irony was not lost on Aldrich, that men trained to operate the great guns of war were now expected to run towards similar weapons operated by the enemy. When the artillery ceased at 5:15, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Confederate General John Breckinridge, commanding the reserves behind the main line, used these precious moments to ensure his artillery crews were ready. The former Vice President of the United States had become one of Lee's most trusted commanders, and he understood that the next hour would likely determine the fate of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Union advance began with Hancock's 2nd Corps on the left flank. Morrison could see the blue lines emerge from their positions, moving forward at the measured pace prescribed by military doctrine. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Thousands of men advancing in formation across the open ground, their bayonets glinting in the early morning sun, regimental colors snapping in the breeze. Confederate Colonel David Weisiger, positioned behind the main defensive line with his Virginia Brigade, watched the Union advance with grim satisfaction. His men had spent the night improving their already formidable earthworks, and the approaching enemy would find no weakness in their defenses. Weisiger had fought at First Manassas, 7 days, Antietam, and Gettysburg, but he had never seen Union forces advance with such apparent desperation. The first Confederate volley erupted like thunder rolling across the landscape. Entire sections of the Union line simply disappeared in the smoke and carnage. Men who had been advancing steadily one moment were cut down the necks, their bodies scattered across the blood-soaked ground. The survivors pressed forward, stepping over their fallen comrades, driven by discipline and the momentum of the charge. Morrison's regiment reached within 50 yards of the Confederate works before the concentrated fire became unbearable. He watched in horror as his company commanders fell one by one, their voices calling out orders that could no longer be heard above the roar of musketry. The main men had advanced farther than most, but they could go no further against such devastating defensive fire. As reported in Harper's Weekly following the battle, Union soldiers began digging hasty field fortifications with their bayonets, cups, and bare hands, anything to create protection from the murderous fire. These impromptu works would save many lives, but they also marked the failure of Grant's grand assault. Instead of breaking through Confederate lines, the Union forces found themselves pinned down in the open, unable to advance or retreat safely. The 6th Corps under Wright met an even more devastating reception in the center. General Wright himself was wounded in the face by Confederate fire as he attempted to rally his men forward. His corps had advanced in column formation, making them perfect targets for Confederate artillery. The result was carnage on a scale that shocked even veterans of previous battles. On the right flank, Smith's 18th Corps initially made better progress, but the success proved illusory. The Confederates had deliberately allowed some Union forces to advance into a salient where they could be caught in crossfire from multiple directions. When the trap was sprung, entire regiments found themselves surrounded and cut to pieces by Confederate fire from front, flank, and rear. By 6 o'clock in the morning, less than 1 hour after the main assault began, it was clear that Grant's attack had failed catastrophically. Union forces lay scattered across the battlefield, many units having lost half their strength or more. The survivors hugged whatever cover they could find, knowing that any attempt to retreat across the open ground would invite further slaughter. The sound of wounded men crying for water and calling for their mothers would haunt the memories of every survivor. Between the lines lay thousands of Union casualties, and any attempt at rescue would have to wait for darkness or a formal truce. The sun climbed higher over Cold Harbor, its rays illuminating a scene of unprecedented carnage. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, bleeding from a grazing wound to his temple, pressed himself against the shallow depression that had become his refuge. Round him, the remnants of his main regiment clung to whatever protection the torn earth provided. The Confederate fire had slackened somewhat, but any movement still drew deadly attention from the enemy works. Private Samuel Wheeler of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery lay mortally wounded. Just yards from Morrison's position, the 19-year-old farmer from Aroostook County had enlisted with dreams of adventure and glory. But now he gasped for breath through lungs filled with blood. His final words, whispered to Morrison, were a request to write to his mother in Presque Isle. Wheeler would be one of over 7,000 Union casualties from this single hour of fighting. Confederate Captain Robert Stiles, serving with the Richmond Howitzers, surveyed the battlefield from his position behind the main Confederate line. A graduate of Yale University and a veteran of 3 years of warfare, Stiles had witnessed many Union assaults, but nothing had prepared him for the scope of destruction he now observed. His artillery battery had fired so rapidly that several gun barrels had become too hot to touch. Yet still the orders came to maintain fire on any Union movement. The defensive positions constructed by Lee's army represented the evolution of military engineering under the pressure of modern warfare. Confederate engineers had learned from earlier battles that simple earthworks were insufficient against concentrated artillery and massed infantry attacks. The works at Cold Harbor featured multiple lines of defense, with communication trenches allowing rapid movement of reserves and supplies. Most importantly, the positions had been surveyed to provide interlocking fields of fire that eliminated dead spaces, where attacking forces might find shelter. General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, arriving late to the battle, attempted to support the failed assault by attacking Confederate positions to the north. Burnside, still haunted by his disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg 18 months earlier, hoped to redeem his reputation with a successful flanking maneuver. His forces advanced with determination, but met the same devastating reception that had shattered the earlier attacks. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, the former Bowdoin College professor who had gained fame at Gettysburg, led his brigade forward with characteristic courage. The 20th Maine and other regiments under his command advanced steadily until they encountered Confederate positions held by Georgian and North Carolinian troops. The ensuing firefight was so intense that Chamberlain later wrote his wife that he had never experienced such concentrated violence in all his years of warfare. As recorded in the personal memoir of Confederate General Evander Law, published in the Southern Historical Society papers decades after the war, the defensive fire was so effective that Union forces were unable to coordinate any meaningful assault. After the first hour, Law noted that his Alabama troops had expended nearly all their ammunition in the opening exchanges, but Union forces were so disrupted that Confederate supply trains were able to bring forward fresh cartridges without interference. The failure of the assault created a tactical stalemate that would persist for days. Union forces found themselves trapped in advanced positions, unable to retreat safely, but equally unable to renew their attack. Confederate forces, while victorious, were too few in number to launch a major counterattack that might have driven Grant's army from the field entirely. Medical personnel from both armies worked frantically to treat the wounded, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed their resources. Union surgeon Jonathan Letterman had revolutionized battlefield medicine during the war, but even his improved ambulance corps and field hospitals could not cope with the thousands of wounded men scattered across the Cold Harbor battlefield. The psychological impact of the failed assault began to manifest itself even during the fighting. Veteran soldiers who had survived previous battles spoke in hushed tones about the hopelessness of their situation. Many began to question whether Grant's strategy of continuous engagement was worth the enormous cost in human lives. Some regiments reported cases of soldiers deliberately shooting themselves in the hand or foot to escape further combat. Confederate morale, by contrast, reached new heights as word of the great victory spread through Lee's army. Despite their numerical disadvantage and dwindling supplies, the Confederate soldiers had proven once again that superior defensive positions and determined leadership could overcome seemingly overwhelming odds. The victory at Cold Harbor would be remembered as one of Lee's tactical masterpieces, even as it came during the Confederate cause's darkest hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Cold Harbor battlefield, turning the area between the opposing lines into a hellish landscape of death and suffering. Wounded Union soldiers who had survived the morning assault now faced a new enemy: dehydration and exposure under the Virginia sun. Many who might have lived with prompt medical attention would die slowly in the no-man's land. Between the armies, Captain Aldrich, still pinned down with his New York regiment, could hear the desperate cries of wounded men calling for water. The sound carried clearly across the battlefield, reaching both Union and Confederate positions. Some Confederate soldiers, moved by basic human compassion, attempted to throw canteens to wounded Union soldiers, but such gestures were rare and often prevented by officers, who feared they might signal the beginning of a Union trick. General Grant, receiving reports of the catastrophic failure at his headquarters behind the Union lines, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. His staff officers brought increasingly grim casualty estimates, 3,000 dead and wounded in the first hour, with numbers climbing steadily as reports arrived from various corps commanders. The sight of ambulances streaming back from the front lines told its own story of the assault's failure. The tactical situation had devolved into something resembling the trench warfare that would characterize conflicts decades in the future. Union forces began digging more elaborate field fortifications, using bayonets, tin cups, and even bare hands to scrape protective earthworks from the Virginia soil. These hasty entrenchments would grow more sophisticated with each passing hour. As both armies settled into what would become an extended siege, Confederate General Jubal Early, commanding a division in Lee's army, took advantage of the Union Army's disruption to probe for weaknesses in Grant's position. Early, known for his aggressive tactics and sharp tongue, believed that a well-timed counterattack might shatter Union morale completely. However, Lee counseled patience, recognizing that his forces lacked the numerical strength to exploit their tactical victory effectively. The medical crisis deepened as the day progressed. Union field hospitals, located in churches, barns, and hastily erected tents, overflowed with wounded soldiers. Surgeons worked without rest, performing amputations and other operations under primitive conditions. The shortage of medical supplies meant that many wounded men received only basic treatment before being evacuated further to the rear. Colonel Francis Barlow, commanding a division in Hancock's 2nd Corps, had been wounded in the morning assault, but continued to direct his men from a stretcher. Barlow, one of the youngest division commanders in the Union Army, exemplified the leadership that had carried the Army of the Potomac through 3 years of warfare. His determination to remain with his troops despite his wounds inspired his subordinates to maintain their positions under impossible conditions. As documented in Bruce Catton's comprehensive Civil War trilogy, which won the Pulitzer Prize for history, the failure at Cold Harbor marked a turning point in Union public opinion regarding Grant's leadership. Northern newspapers, which had initially supported Grant's aggressive strategy, began to question whether the enormous casualties were justified by military necessity. The Confederate perspective differed markedly from Union accounts of the battle. Southern soldiers, while sympathetic to the suffering of their enemies, took pride in their defensive victory. Many Confederate units had suffered relatively light casualties, while inflicting devastating losses on attacking Union forces. This tactical success provided a brief respite from the grim reality of their strategic situation. Water became a critical concern for troops on both sides. As the temperature climbed into the 80s, Confederate forces, fighting from prepared positions with established supply lines, had better access to water than Union forces trapped in advanced positions. The sound of wounded men begging for water continued throughout the day, creating a psychological burden that affected soldiers from both armies. The failure to achieve breakthrough meant that Grant would need to reconsider his entire strategy. For the Virginia campaign, the Army of the Potomac had suffered enormous casualties since crossing the Rapidan River, and public support for continued offensive operations was beginning to waver. Politicians in Washington began to pressure Grant to find alternatives to the costly frontal assaults that had characterized the Overland campaign. As evening approached, both commanders faced difficult decisions about their next moves. Lee had won a significant tactical victory, but his army remained outnumbered and increasingly isolated. Grant, despite the day's setback, retained substantial advantages in manpower and supplies, but he would need to find new methods to employ these advantages effectively. Against Lee's defensive genius. By the evening of June 3rd, the cries of wounded men lying between the lines had become unbearable for soldiers on both sides. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, still trapped in his forward position, listened to the agonized pleas of Private Wheeler and dozens of other wounded men who lay scattered across the battlefield. The young soldier from Maine had been calling for water for hours, his voice growing weaker with each passing moment. As evening approached, both commanders faced difficult decisions about their next moves. Lee had won a significant tactical victory, but his army remained outnumbered and increasingly isolated. Grant, despite the day's setback, retained substantial advantages in manpower and supplies, but he would need to find new methods to employ these advantages effectively. Against Lee's defensive genius. By the evening of June 3rd, the cries of wounded men lying between the lines had become unbearable for soldiers on both sides. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, still trapped in his forward position, listened to the agonized pleas of Private Wheeler and dozens of other wounded men who lay scattered across the battlefield. The young soldier from Maine had been calling for water for hours, his voice growing weaker with each passing moment. The tactical stalemate continued into June 4th and 5th, with neither army able to gain significant advantage. Union forces remained pinned in their advanced positions, while Confederate troops maintained their defensive lines. The wounded men between the armies suffered through 2 more days of heat and exposure, their desperate situation becoming a source of anguish for combatants on both sides. Confederate Private William Dame of the Richmond Howitzers later wrote in his memoir about the moral conflict created by the sounds of suffering Union soldiers. Dame and his comrades could clearly hear wounded men calling for their mothers, begging for water, and praying for death to end their agony. Some Confederate soldiers violated orders by throwing canteens toward Union positions, but such acts of mercy were sporadic and insufficient to address the scale of human suffering. General Grant faced mounting pressure from his subordinate commanders to arrange some form of truce to recover the wounded. General Winfield Scott Hancock, whose Second Corps had suffered the heaviest casualties, repeatedly requested permission to arrange a temporary ceasefire. Other corps commanders echoed Hancock's concerns, arguing that basic humanity demanded action to rescue men who had fought bravely for their country. The delay in arranging a truce stemmed partly from military protocol and partly from Grant's reluctance to appear weak after such a devastating defeat. Traditional military courtesy required that the defeated party request a truce to recover their wounded, but Grant hesitated to make such a formal acknowledgement of failure. Meanwhile, hundreds of wounded men continued to suffer and die in the Virginia heat. Lee faced his own moral dilemma regarding the wounded Union soldiers. Confederate forces could hear the suffering clearly from their positions, and many Southern soldiers expressed sympathy for their wounded enemies. However, Lee could not unilaterally declare a truce without appearing to violate accepted military protocols. The Confederate commander waited for Grant to make the first move while his own soldiers struggled with the sounds of human agony. Captain Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers recorded in his post-war writings that Confederate soldiers began requesting permission to provide aid to wounded Union soldiers on June 5th. Officers found themselves in the difficult position of maintaining military discipline, while their men expressed natural human compassion for suffering enemies. Some units reported near mutinous sentiment among soldiers who wanted to help the wounded regardless of orders. The breaking point came on the evening of June 5th when a wounded Union soldier, delirious from pain and dehydration, began singing hymns in a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire battlefield. The sound of Amazing Grace performed by a dying man created an emotional response that transcended military divisions. Soldiers from both armies later recalled this moment as one of the most moving experiences of their military service. Finally, on June 7th, Grant sent a formal request to Lee for a 2-hour truce to recover Union wounded. The delay had proven catastrophic for hundreds of men who might have survived with earlier medical attention. When truce parties finally ventured onto the battlefield, they found that most of the wounded had already died from their injuries or from exposure to the elements. as reported in the Atlantic Monthly's comprehensive analysis of the battle published in 1865. The failure to arrange an earlier truce became one of the most controversial aspects of the Cold Harbor engagement. Northern newspapers criticized Grant's delay, while Southern publications questioned why Lee had not initiated humanitarian efforts. The incident highlighted the tension between military necessity and human decency that characterized much of the Civil War. The truce itself was heartbreaking in its revelations. Union burial parties found that many wounded men had crawled toward Confederate lines seeking water and medical attention. Some had made it within yards of Confederate positions before dying. Confederate soldiers who participated in the truce reported being deeply affected by the sight of Union soldiers who had died slowly and painfully over several days. Private Wheeler of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery was found among the dead, having survived until June 6 before succumbing to his wounds. Morrison, who had promised to write to Wheeler's mother, would carry the guilt of the young man's death for the rest of his life. The letter he eventually sent to Presque Isle would be one of thousands of similar communications that brought news of Cold Harbor's tragedy to families across the North. The tactical disaster at Cold Harbor forced Grant to fundamentally reconsider his approach to the Virginia campaign. The Union Army of the Potomac had suffered approximately 12,000 casualties during the Cold Harbor operations, with the vast majority occurring in the first hour of the June 3 assault. Confederate losses numbered fewer than 2,000, creating a casualty ratio that even Grant's supporters found difficult to justify. General George Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac under Grant's direction, privately expressed serious doubts about continuing the strategy of direct confrontation with Lee's army. Meade, a cautious professional soldier, had witnessed the steady degradation of his army's fighting capability. Through weeks of constant combat, the survivors of Cold Harbor represented a force that was numerically strong, but psychologically damaged by repeated encounters with Confederate defensive positions. The impact on Union morale extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Regiments that had fought with distinction at Gettysburg and other earlier engagements now showed signs of severe battle fatigue. Officers reported increasing instances of desertion, self-inflicted wounds, and what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions. The Army of the Potomac had reached a breaking point that threatened its effectiveness. As a fighting force, Confederate morale experienced a corresponding boost from the victory. But Lee understood that tactical success could not alter his army's deteriorating strategic position. The Army of Northern Virginia had successfully repelled Grant's assault, but it remained trapped in defensive positions with limited supplies and no prospect of significant reinforcement. Lee's correspondence with Confederate officials in Richmond revealed his awareness that time favored the Union cause despite temporary setbacks. President Abraham Lincoln faced mounting political pressure in Washington as news of the Cold Harbor casualties reached the Northern public. The 1864 presidential election approached, and Lincoln's prospects depended heavily on military success in Virginia. Opposition politicians, particularly the Democratic candidate George McClellan, used the Cold Harbor casualties to argue that Lincoln's administration had pursued the war with reckless disregard for human life. The international implications of Cold Harbor also concerned Union leadership. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, closely monitored American military developments for signs of Union weakness. A prolonged stalemate in Virginia might encourage European recognition of Confederate independence, a diplomatic development that could fundamentally alter the war's outcome. Grant's response to the Cold Harbor setback demonstrated the strategic flexibility that distinguished him from previous Union commanders. Rather than continuing futile frontal assaults, Grant began planning a bold maneuver to cross the James River and attack Richmond from the south. This decision represented a fundamental shift from the overland campaign's strategy of direct confrontation to a more sophisticated approach that would utilize Union advantages in mobility and logistics. The transition away from Cold Harbor required careful coordination between multiple Union armies operating in Virginia. General Benjamin Butler's Army of the James, positioned south of Richmond, would need to coordinate with Grant's movements to create maximum pressure on Confederate forces. Similarly, General Philip Sheridan's cavalry would play a crucial role in screening Union movements and disrupting Confederate communications. Lee, anticipating Grant's likely response to the Cold Harbor stalemate, began positioning Confederate forces to counter potential Union movements. The Confederate commander's ability to read his opponent's intentions had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the campaign, and he correctly predicted that Grant would seek to avoid further direct confrontations. Lee's challenge lay in defending multiple potential objectives with an army that continued to shrink through casualties and desertion. The Cold Harbor experience also influenced tactical innovations on both sides. Union forces began employing more sophisticated field fortifications, recognizing that defensive positions could multiply the effectiveness of smaller forces. Confederate engineers, meanwhile, refined their defensive techniques based on lessons learned from repelling the Union assault. Medical personnel from both armies collaborated to develop improved procedures for treating battlefield casualties. The horror of wounded men dying between the lines for days led to informal agreements about medical truces and the treatment of wounded prisoners. These developments represented rare instances of humanitarian progress emerging from military catastrophe. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended beyond the immediate participants to affect families and communities throughout the North. The heavy casualties among converted artillery regiments, particularly units from Maine and New York, created concentrated grief in specific communities. These losses would influence Northern public opinion about the war's conduct and contribute to growing demands for a negotiated settlement.